Bear Brook State Park sits about 10 miles southeast of Concord, New Hampshire's capital. It is a place of trails and streams and the particular quiet that settles over New England forests in the late autumn, when the tourists have gone and the leaves have fallen and the light comes in low and cold across the water. It is, by every outward measure, a pleasant place. What happened here, or rather, what was hidden here, is among the most disturbing stories in the long, disturbing history of American cold cases. November 10th, 1985. A man walking through the park came across something that should not have been there. A black metal barrel, roughly the size of a standard 55-gallon drum, sitting in the underbrush about 150 feet off the main trail. He called the police. Inside the barrel, investigators found two bodies. A woman, estimated to be in her mid to late 20s. A child, a girl estimated to be between 7 and 9 years old. Both had been killed. Both had been there for years. Neither one had a name. 15 years later, on May 9th, 2000, investigators working on the case returned to the area around Bear Brook with ground-penetrating equipment. About 100 yards from where the first barrel had been found. Close enough that the original investigation should have found it, but far enough away in dense enough vegetation that it hadn't. They found a second barrel. Inside, two more children, a girl estimated to be 3 to 5 years old, a girl estimated to be 1 to 3 years old, 4 victims. 2 barrels. 40 years, give or take, of questions. The Bear Brook case would eventually become one of the most consequential cold cases in the history of forensic genetic genealogy, not because it was the most dramatic or the most widely publicized, but because it was one of the first. The case that proved what was possible, the case that built the methodology, the case that changed everything. But first, for years, it was simply a mystery. Investigators who responded to the 1985 discovery worked the case as thoroughly as 1985 allowed. The woman, the adult victim, was between approximately 23 and 33 years old. She had dark hair. She had been beaten to death. DNA analysis of the children determined that the older girl, approximately 7 to 9 years old, was the biological daughter of the adult woman. The younger child in the first barrel, who investigators initially called Baby Doe, appeared to be related to the others, though the exact relationship was unclear. The adult woman and the older child appeared to have died at approximately the same time, sometime between the mid-1970s and the mid-1980s. They had almost certainly been killed elsewhere and transported to the park in the barrel. New Hampshire investigators submitted dental records, put out press releases, worked the traditional channels. Nothing came back. In 2000, when the second barrel was found with 2 more children, the investigation expanded. The 4 victims were almost certainly connected. The same perpetrator had placed all 4 bodies in this park. DNA analysis confirmed some relationships. The adult woman and the older child in the first barrel were biologically related. The 2 children in the second barrel were also connected. One appeared to be related to the adult woman. The other, the youngest, who would eventually be identified as Rhea Rasmussen, was not biologically related to the adult woman, but was the biological daughter of the person who had killed them all. The investigators knew they were dealing with a single killer. They knew, or strongly suspected, that the adult woman and most of the children were a family unit. They knew that the victims were likely from somewhere in the northeastern United States or possibly California, based on isotopic analysis of their teeth and bones. They did not know their names, and the man who had killed them was, at this point in the story, unknown. The bodies in the barrels had been exposed to decades of temperature fluctuation, moisture, and bacterial activity. The DNA in bones and teeth from such conditions is notoriously difficult to work with. Standard STR profiling, the CODIS approach, had failed. The samples were simply too degraded, but by the mid-2000s, a new approach was emerging. the kind of whole genome sequencing that Othram and companies like it would eventually formalize into a standard process, and the DNA Doe project was beginning to explore what was possible. In January 2017, New Hampshire State Police announced a development in the Bear Brook investigation that seemed, at the time, extraordinary. Using forensic genetic genealogy, investigators had identified the likely suspect, the person who had almost certainly killed the 4 victims in the barrels. His name, at least as far as the investigation was concerned, was Bob Evans. He wasn't really Bob Evans. He was never Bob Evans. That was just one of the names. Terry Peter Rasmussen was born on December 23, 1943, in Denver, Colorado. His grandparents on his father's side were Danish immigrants. By all accounts, his early life was unremarkable. He grew up in Colorado, married in 1968, had 4 children between 1969 and 1972, and lived for a time in Phoenix, Arizona, and Redwood City, California. Between approximately 1973 and 1974, something changed. His wife left him. His family last saw him around Christmas of 1974. Then the aliases began. What investigators would eventually piece together, working backward from the DNA evidence, forward through decades of records, is a portrait of a man who had become, in every meaningful sense, a ghost. He moved constantly. He used different names in different states. He formed relationships with women, often women who were vulnerable or isolated, and he left violence in his wake. His known victims, the ones that can be confirmed or strongly suspected, include Marlise Honeychurch, a woman from Southern California whom he dated beginning in 1978. When Honeychurch appeared with Rasmussen at her family's Thanksgiving dinner in November 1978 and then left with him after a minor argument, it was the last time her family saw her alive. She was traveling with her 2 daughters, 6-year-old Marie Elizabeth Vaughn and 1-year-old Sarah Lynn McWaters. All 3 of them, Marlise, Marie, and Sarah, were among the Bear Brook victims. The identification of Terry Rasmussen as the Bear Brook killer was, in the words of those who were involved, a landmark moment. It was the first time forensic genetic genealogy had been used to identify a criminal suspect, not to identify a victim, to identify a perpetrator. The Bear Brook case proved that the methodology worked not just for naming the dead, but for naming those who killed them. Rasmussen's path through the criminal justice system is a grim testament to what a sufficiently determined, sufficiently skilled killer could accomplish in the pre-digital age. After killing the Bear Brook victims in the late 1970s or early 1980s, Rasmussen continued his predatory movements. He abducted the surviving daughter of one of his likely victims, raising her in California under a series of false identities. In 1985, he was arrested in California as Curtis Kimball on a charge of child endangerment. He served time, was released, disappeared again. In 2002, under yet another identity, he murdered his then-girlfriend, Yoon Soon Jun, in California. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years to life. He died in prison on December 28, 2010, 5 days after his 67th birthday, before anyone knew what he had done in New Hampshire. Law enforcement believes Rasmussen may have killed as many as 6 people in a criminal career that spanned at least 3 decades and multiple states. The full extent of his crimes may never be known, but the identification of his victims, the Bear Brook victims, changed what the world understood about forensic genetic genealogy. It was not just a theoretical possibility. It was not just a research methodology. It was a working tool that could, with sufficient evidence and sufficient expertise, identify killers who had spent decades hiding in plain sight. Identifying Rasmussen as the killer was only half the work. The other half, and in some ways the more important half, was identifying his victims. The bodies in the barrels had been there for decades. The DNA was badly degraded. The standard genealogical approaches that had worked for Rasmussen, working from the Y chromosome, which passes relatively intact through the male line, were harder to apply to female victims. Barbara Ray Venter and the DNA Doe Project worked methodically through the challenge. For months, Ray Venter attempted to build genealogical profiles from the degraded DNA of the victims. The work was painstaking. The matches she found in consumer databases were distant, fourth cousins, fifth cousins, matches so remote that the family trees she needed to build would have to branch across dozens of generations. At the same time, from a completely different direction, an amateur investigator named Becky Heath was working on the case from her home in Connecticut. Becky Heath's story is, in many ways, the story of the amateur genealogist in the DNA age. She was not a scientist. She was not a trained investigator. She was a Connecticut researcher who had become fascinated by cold cases, had spent years combing through genealogical databases and forum discussions, and had, through sheer patience and attention, assembled a piece of the puzzle that the professionals had missed. Heath's tip reached investigators in October 2018. At the same moment, Ray Venter's genealogical research was converging on the same family. In June 2019, the New Hampshire Attorney General's office announced that 3 of the 4 Bear Brook victims had been identified. The adult woman, Marlice Elizabeth Honeychurch, 23, last seen in California in November 1978. The older child, Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, age 6, Marlice's daughter. The younger child in the first barrel, Sarah Lynn McWaters, age 1, also Marlice's daughter from a different father. They had names. Marlice Honeychurch's family, her mother, her siblings, her extended relatives, had spent 40 years not knowing what had happened to her. The police had been contacted when she disappeared. Missing persons reports had been filed. And then the trail went cold, as trails did in 1978, as trails still do. When the identification was announced, Marlice's family gathered for a memorial service in New Hampshire. They stood near the place where she had been found, 40 years after she had been killed. Her brother David Salomon spoke publicly about the other child, the 4th victim, still unidentified, who was not related to Marlice. He named her Angel. He said he hoped that child's family would eventually have the same closure that his family had finally found. It would take 6 more years. The 4th victim, the child in the second barrel who was not biologically related to Marlice Honeychurch, had, from the beginning, presented the most difficult challenge of the Bear Brook case. The DNA analysis had established 2 things. She was Terry Rasmussen's biological daughter, and she was not Marlice's child. These facts were simultaneously clarifying and complicating. They meant the 4th victim had a completely different family line on her mother's side, a family that would have to be found independently. And they meant that somewhere, a woman, the 4th victim's mother, had either disappeared into history or was herself another of Rasmussen's victims. In early 2024, the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit partnered with the DNA Doe Project to make a final push toward identifying the child they had been calling the middle child, or Rhea, a placeholder name given by the investigation because they had nothing else. The work, carried out by students and volunteers at the DNA Doe Project using the most advanced available genealogical tools, eventually identified the child's mother, a woman named Pepper Reed, born in 1952 in Texas, who had last been seen by her family in Houston in the late 1970s. From Pepper Reed, the team moved to her daughter, Rhea Rasmussen, born 1976. Orange County, California. On September 5, 2024, the identification was officially confirmed through documentary records, including Rhea's birth certificate, which listed both Pepper Reed and Terry Rasmussen as her parents. On September 7, 2025, the New Hampshire Attorney General announced the identification publicly. All 4 victims had their names. DNA Doe Project, investigative genetic genealogist Gina Feehery, who worked the case, described the moment of identification in a public statement. The team, she said, had been prepared for the possibility that they might only be able to identify the child's mother, that the trail might dead end there. Instead, they were able to name both Pepper Reed and her daughter Rhea. Returning both Pepper and Rhea's names to them, their families, and the greater community is the best possible outcome we could have hoped for. Pepper Reed has not been found. She is presumed to be a victim of Terry Rasmussen, another entry in the long, terrible accounting of what he did. The investigation into his movements between 1974 and 1985 across New Hampshire, California, Arizona, Texas, Oregon, and Virginia remains active. There may be other victims. There may be other families waiting. The work continues. The Bear Brook case is, in the history of forensic genetic genealogy, something more than a cold case solved. It was a proof of concept that arrived at precisely the right moment, when the technology was new enough that many investigators were skeptical, and when the potential of the approach needed to be demonstrated, not just asserted. Before Bear Brook, forensic genetic genealogy was a theoretical tool with a handful of pilot applications. After Bear Brook, it was proven, demonstrably, publicly, undeniably proven, that you could use DNA to identify both killers and victims who had been unknown for decades. There is one more dimension to Bear Brook that is worth sitting with before we move forward. The Bear Brook case is the story of 4 people, a young woman and 3 small children, who were killed by a man who used aliases and moved constantly and was, for more than 40 years, completely unknown to investigators. In the pre-DNA genealogy world, this was entirely possible. A sufficiently determined, sufficiently mobile killer could simply become someone else, over and over, until the trail grew cold in every jurisdiction. What forensic genetic genealogy has done, and what Bear Brook demonstrated, is close that loophole permanently. You can change your name. You cannot change your DNA. And as long as someone in your extended family has shared their DNA with a consumer testing service, there is a thread that leads back to you. Terry Peter Rasmussen's biological son shared his DNA. That was the thread. 40 years later, it was enough.